Us on CBC News Network, streaming around the world on our app and at CBC.ca. We're standing by as we do for the Prime Minister's daily pandemic update. He is expected to talk more about a new government support plan for businesses impacted by COVID-19. It was released just over an hour ago by Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau and Navdeep Bains, Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. It's a program geared to mid-size and much larger businesses. The government calls it LEAF. It's an acronym for a very long, clunky name, the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility Program. Governments are good at making long, clunky names. Its cornerstone, though, in Minister Morneau's words, is bridge financing to prevent bankruptcies, insolvencies, to try and keep these companies, big companies, alive until the economy is back. Of course, we will also take you to Quebec, where it is a back-to-school day in most of the province, but in a very different way for thousands of kids outside the Greater Montreal region. Elementary schools and daycares are gradually reopening starting today. I should mention it is not mandatory at this stage to send your kids back, and we'll talk to a couple of people struggling with that decision. But let's go to this major piece of policy announced earlier this morning by Bill Morneau and Navdeep Bains, and the Prime Minister will talk more about too in about 15 minutes' time. I'll bring in my colleagues, the CBC's David Cochrane and the host of Power and Politics, Vashi Kapellas. Good to see you both. So this was a major announcement done at 9:30 because of the markets and the impact that this could have on the markets. And the question everybody sort of had was, is this the so-called sectoral aid package that the oil and gas industry, that airlines, that tourism had been asking for, and how will it help those sectors? And I think the short answer is yes, sort of. This is what the government has come up with. Vashi, over to you.
Yeah, I think yes, sort of is the perfect way to put it. Obviously, the way in which it's being presented is not as an aid package directly for the airlines or directly for the oil sector, but we know over the last 6 to 8 weeks that those two sectors have been particularly hard hit. We know the entire economy is hard hit, but when you look at the oil patch, for example, they had the double whammy of a price war combined with depressed demand. And then when you look at the airline industry and tourism industry more largely, I mean, they have completely stopped, for the most part, operating. I think Air Canada took a $1 billion loss on just the last quarter. And of course, that's before everything really hit. That only involves about 2 weeks of this pandemic. So the way in which it's being presented is not as direct support or directed towards those specific sectors, but more broadly speaking to big companies that need some liquidity, that need some money to get through this. So it's kind of like a bridge program to get you to the other side of the pandemic, which is very much similar to the kind of aid offered so far to smaller and medium-sized businesses. I think there are, though, because of the nature of this, because of the fact that it's big companies we're talking about, a lot of questions for the government about how this is going to work. And my primary question is, how transparent will it be? In the past, when there has been aid, and obviously it's been different, quote unquote bailouts versus loans. This is a loan, but in the past there has been a lack of transparency about how those loans were made, what the conditions attached to them were. There were some conditions, for example, in 2008, 2009, but we still see things happening like part of the loan being written off years later or a plant closing. I think for Canadians who are watching today, their primary concern is if you're going to use money, taxpayer money, to help big companies, which have been at times very profitable, weather this storm, please make sure that they end up employing Canadians for a while, that they keep their business in this country, and that there is some level of accountability for the money that they are able to access. Now, the government does say that there will be strings attached. For example, limits on executive pay, dividends, share buybacks. They can't be already involved in insolvency proceedings, so you can't already be facing bankruptcy, and this is just pulling you out of that. They have to respect collective agreements with unions. So, for example, pensions will be part of that. But there's still a lot of fine print missing. How much will executive pay be limited? Things like that. I think obviously it's going to be dependent on the specific terms of the loan and the specific specific company to a certain degree. But those questions, I think, are important ones for Canadians who are about to fork over a lot of cash.
Yeah, it is notably different from the auto bailout plan that you wrote about over the weekend, Vashi, in that we will not end up having an equity stake in any of these companies. And so we won't be able to sort of influence them in the same way we did when it came to the auto bailout, even though there are all of those conditions. And that will be interesting to see, because that was sort of an incentive for auto companies to get the government their money back and get them out of their hair and their private business. In this case, they are really presenting it as bridge financing. And David, I know you've been watching this as well. One thing that struck me from Navdeep Bains this morning, that he said it's not about one sector, it's about all sectors having the ability to navigate through this crisis.
Yeah, I guess one person's bridge is another person's bailout, right? But when you look at this, this is really designed to try to help companies, big companies now. We've put a credit floor under small companies with the $40,000 credit line. There's been up to $6 million in credit available to medium-sized companies, now $60 million or more for large companies, described in this program as companies with annual revenue of more than $300 million. So we're talking about the biggest big players in the Canadian economy who, despite their large size, their large profits in the past, and their retained earnings, may still end up in a situation where they got to say, "Shag it, we got to lay some people off. We just can't keep going." So the numbers here, loans of $60 million or more, just to put it in a little bit of context, the auto bailout 10, 12 years ago, that was $13.7 billion just for GM and Chrysler, right, from the Canadian government, in addition to a big pile of money from the American governments. So it's not even in that order of magnitude, and it seems that this is sort of a credit bridge to try to avoid the bailout, to find a way for people to stay in operations, to avoid getting to that insolvency level where a large-scale bailout is in fact required. Though I don't know if this necessarily precludes it, because one of the things we heard from Navdeep Bains earlier this morning, Rosie, is that they're looking at the pressure points in the economy, or the pain points in the economy. And they're doing sector by sector analysis to see which sectors are doing worse than others. And I think in some ways the political conversation and the journalistic conversation about the need for a sectoral bailout was a little bit too narrow. We kept talking about energy/oil, we kept talking about airlines and hospitality. Bill Morneau mentioned a different one this morning that kind of slipped our attention: non-essential retail. If you're not allowed to operate and you can't do curbside pickup, you're in a really tough spot right now. And there are big chains who are sitting on lots of inventory that they've already paid for that they can't move, with employees they're trying to keep alive. So this extension of credit to the big players, stacked on top of the wage subsidy, gives them the tools they need to keep their workforce intact for the next little while. Because one of the other questions Bill Morneau, the finance minister, was asked today is like, how long will this be in place for? When can we expect people to be paid back? Nobody can give you any kind of a specific time frame on any of these programs, because as we're seeing in other countries that are reopening, they're getting spikes in their cases. So we don't yet know what the Canadian experience will be like going forward.
And you're right to flag the retail sector, because 2.1 million Canadians work in that industry. So it's not a small amount of people. Vashi, I do want to get your thoughts, and I'll come back to you too, David, about the oil and gas industry, because there is inside what we've seen so far. We don't know all the conditions for how this will work, but there is certainly a condition around climate change. It says that companies must publish climate-related disclosure and outline how future operations will support climate goals. Now, there are lots of oil companies in Alberta that are very committed to climate change and are actively doing things. But I'm not sure that would be the case for all. I'm not sure what that would look like. And given the things that Jason Kenney has said in the past number of weeks, I wonder if this is going to answer the demands of the Premier.
Yeah, that's my biggest question too, because estimates that the province had put on the kind of liquidity that bigger companies in the patch needed was, as little as, or not as little, at least $20 billion. So you're looking at $20 to $30 billion. I'm not really sure yet, based on what the announcement we heard today, if this fills that need. I don't know, to be totally honest. But I think that's going to be the question that that the patch is going to have. As far as the climate conditions, and that is for recipient companies. So not companies necessarily that are applying, but if you get the money, you're going to have to disclose basically what you're doing as far as climate change and if it fits into the government's plan. Now, that's a pretty broad way to look at it. I don't know, for example, how it's going to be analyzed. How do you know if, okay, does this fit into the plan? And if it doesn't, 5 years from now, does that mean you just pull the money back? Like, I don't think the details of that are very clear. The one thing, the caveat I would add is that actually with big companies, the big oil companies are way way ahead of the game compared to some of the smaller ones, at least when it comes to transparency around climate change policies. Many of them, for example, were leading the charge for a carbon tax over the past couple of years. What they wanted was certainty, not there to be no punishment or no sort of penalization for carbon emissions. They just wanted certainty. And those big companies, and particularly let's take Suncor or Cenovus, those are ones that, from my understanding and speaking with officials, were sort of at the being thought about when crafting this policy. So those are typical companies that would benefit from something like this. But politically speaking, there are going to be a lot of questions for this government, right? I mean, they ran on an agenda that, of course, was very climate focused. It's hard in this environment during a pandemic to tell these big companies that employ tens of thousands of Canadians, no, sorry, you don't qualify. I think this measure around disclosing climate plans is certainly meant to allay those concerns. But I can imagine that bailing out big oil companies, and I know it's not a bailout, but a big loan that will eventually tide them over, is not necessarily going to go over with some of the constituencies that voted for the Liberals in the first place. Clearly, they have made the decision to do so, but there's a political context to all of this as well.
Yeah, that's for sure. And I think the language around it is probably very intentional as well. The fact that no one is wanting to call it a bailout, and the fact that it is a loan, probably, David, I'll just get your thoughts on this, probably does insulate the Liberals a little bit from criticism that they might have otherwise got, that they were handing over money to the oil and gas companies, provided, of course, they get it back.
Well, look, Rosie, I think, quite frankly, what's been happening practically every day since the 13th of March has been a Canadian-wide bailout that's being built piece by piece by piece. Whether it's for families, small business, all of it taken in its totality, you're going to be north of $300-400 billion in either direct spending or loans or deferred taxes once all of this is done. I do think, yes, there was an acute sensitivity to be seen to just put money directly into large-scale oil companies, given the particular makeup of their caucus and the voting base that the Liberals appeal to. You go back to the Tech Frontier decision that earlier this year, where there was massive divisions inside the Liberal caucus over whether to approve a project from a proponent that was playing ball with all of the climate requirements that the Liberals are kind of putting on the table. But, a largely urban and eastern environmental caucus had great discomfort with it. Already you're seeing some reaction to this from people like Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, who is taking particular aim at the idea of tax evasion and tax havens, where the government has said that if you've been convicted of tax evasion, you will not qualify for this, and that's fine. But there are companies that structure their operations in such a way that maybe they move to a low tax state in the United States so they can be full participants of NAFTA and still participate in the Canadian economy, but they avoid paying the higher Canadian taxes or whatever jurisdiction they may move to. So already that is being targeted. So whatever program they put out, it is going to be attacked and criticized for who it leaves out or who it puts in, based on the outlook and the political viewpoint of the critic that is speaking. But this is a big move for big companies, and I think, Rosie, it shows us just the vulnerability that exists throughout the Canadian economy. I mean, it was obvious to see that small and medium-sized businesses would have trouble. There are still a lot of issues to be resolved around commercial rents. The program that has been rolled out is clunky and not getting exactly rave reviews the way some of the more streamlined and coherent aid programs are. But this one, there's a lot of big companies that are going to qualify for aid that a lot of people are just not going to like. But when you're trying to put a floor under a G7 economy and have enough capacity that when things do start to lift, you can come back and keep people employed, there are some choices you have to make that are going to carry with them some political unpopularity. And making this as universal as possible certainly insulates them from that specific criticism that they're doing this specifically for the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah, and it helps, I think, in some ways, as the Prime Minister has said every day, that they decided to help individual Canadians first with the CERB. So there was a sort of ramp up of how they would deal with all this. I'm not sure if we're 2 minutes away or not. I don't have my email, but I'm going to try and squeeze in a guest if I can. Jody Breckenridge is a parent who lives in Canton de Atli, Quebec, south of Sherbrooke. And she has decided today not to send her son back to school. Jody, good to see you. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. I may cut you off for the Prime Minister. You'll forgive me if I do that. But tell me why you decided not to send your son back to school today.
Simply because there's not enough proof out there that we can form our antibodies naturally to fight this disease. It's just plain and simple.
And even with the measures that the school has put in place or is required to put in place around physical distancing, 15 kids per room, that was not enough to reassure you that your son, I'm not sure how old he is, he's younger, but that he would be able to follow those rules?
I don't have an issue with him following the rules. He's 11, so he knows, kind of the, and he's educated about what's going on. It's more, it's more there's not going to be any kind of new materials taught or anything else, and I think that he'll be better off at home. This way he'll get physical activity and more stimulation here than he would back in a classroom.
Of course, I guess that means you're in a position to keep him at home, though. I guess that means, right?
Yes, we are. We're very fortunate to be able to stay at home and become more involved.
Do you think it makes sense for kids to be going back at all?
Look at given the time frame, no, I don't. They're not going to be in school for very long, only a few weeks. And as I mentioned earlier, they can't teach any new material. So it's just going to be basic, cognitive stimulation, from what I understand. And they can't really socialize. They can't go out and play. They can't do the stuff that they normally do with their friends. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense.
We might, by September, we might be doing better, but still not, where we need to be. We certainly won't have a vaccine. What will it take for you to feel safe enough to send your son back to school?
Well, first of all, the numbers have to drop, of people, new cases, deaths, and so on and so forth. Also, I think given more time to the school systems so that they can come up with better measures. Mm-hmm. I feel that everything was rushed for the teachers, for the students, for all staff involved in our educational system.
Okay.
I think, yeah.
I was just going to cut you off, Jody, because the Prime Minister's speaking. I hope you don't mind. He's popped out. My best to you and to your family and to your son. Take care of yourselves. Thanks for speaking with us. And now let's listen to the Prime Minister of Canada.
For going above and beyond, not just these days, but every day. I'd
like to begin this morning by saying that this is the National Nursing Week. Nurses are at the very heart of our healthcare system. Every day they are doing an outstanding job to keep us all healthy. And the way they support people during this pandemic reflects their compassion, their resilience, and their dedication. To all the nurses out there, thank you for everything you're doing, not just these days, but every single day.
Since the beginning, our response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been driven by three fundamental objectives. The first is to keep Canadians safe and ensure we take every possible step to protect our most vulnerable citizens. This work continues daily, guided by our best doctors and medical experts, and it drives every move we make. The second is to protect individuals, workers, and families from the worst financial impacts of this pandemic, so you can put food on the table and cover your bills while staying safe. We're doing that with programs such as the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the increase in the Canada Child Benefit this month, and the enhanced GST tax credit, among other measures. And thirdly, we are helping Canadian businesses through this extraordinary time, including for-profit, not-for-profit, and charitable enterprises, to ensure that workers across Canada can keep their jobs, so we can come roaring back after this difficult time is behind us. Aujourd'hui,
Today, I am announcing the next phase of our support measures for businesses which collectively employ millions of Canadians and who have suffered unprecedented losses because of the pandemic. We will be extending the business credit program that was initially created so that small businesses can remain financially sound by including mid-sized businesses that need more capital. Export Development Canada and the Business Development Canada will be working with private sector lenders to increase access to capital by many tens of millions of dollars for Canadian companies in all industry sectors and all regions of the country. We will also be introducing the Large Employer Emergency Financing Facility to help large companies that cannot receive funding through other means to get through this crisis. But I want to be clear. This is bridge financing, not a blank check. We are providing support to these large employers in order to protect millions of jobs right across the country. Our approach is based on a number of fundamental principles. First, we want to avoid seeing businesses go under. The goal of the business credit program is not to fund non-viable businesses or allow them to restructure. It is not our intention either to provide low-interest loans to large companies that don't need them. Second, we want to be fair. This funding will be accessible to all sectors and to all provinces and territories. And third, we will protect people's jobs. That is the most important thing. Businesses that receive this assistance will have to make certain commitments and keep them. For example, maintain jobs and investments, abide by collective agreements and their obligations with respect to pensions, and make specific commitments with respect to the environment. More specifically, there will be strict limits on dividends, share buybacks, and executive pay. In order to counter tax evasion and tax avoidance, businesses will have to disclose their financial structure when they apply for this funding.
Today, I am announcing the next phase of our support for enterprises that collectively employ millions of Canadians and are experiencing unprecedented losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are expanding the business credit availability program put in place to keep small businesses solvent to mid-sized companies with a greater need for capital. Export Development Canada and the Business Development Bank of Canada will work with private sector lenders to free up access to capital in the tens of millions for Canadian companies in every industry and in all regions across Canada. At the same time, we are establishing a large employer emergency financing facility to provide bridge financing for our largest employers if they are unable to obtain financing through other means. But let me be clear, these are bridge loans, not bailouts. Just as we are finding ways to support small and medium-sized businesses, we'll provide loans to the largest enterprises to help them weather the storm and protect the millions of jobs they provide across Canada. In providing this support, we will be guided by several basic principles. The first is to avoid bankruptcies. Our purpose is to keep large Canadian companies on their feet and protect the millions of jobs they provide. The goal here is not to fix pre-existing insolvencies or restructurings, nor is it to provide low-cost lending to companies that don't need it. Second, we will be fair. Financing will be accessible to every industry sector in a way that is consistent in every province and territory right across Canada. And critically, we will protect workers and hold companies accountable. This is fundamental. Any company that receives this support will be expected to make and keep certain commitments. Those include maintaining jobs and investment, respecting collective agreements and pension obligations, and environmental and climate commitments. In particular, there will be strict limits on dividends, share buybacks, and executive compensation. To stand strong against tax avoidance and tax evasion, we will require companies to share with us their complete financial structure as they apply for funding. With this program, we're taking a bold step. Ideally, private sector lenders are adequate for the needs of large businesses. But in an extraordinary situation when that isn't always enough, we must act to prevent massive harm to Canadian workers and families and the Canadian economy. We will not allow millions of people to lose their livelihoods because of unprecedented events beyond their control. Finally, as we continue to work on plans to reopen, I want to say this. Please let caution and medical advice be your guides. We are all anxious to see life go back to something that looks more like normal. But we're not out of the woods yet, and we cannot squander the sacrifices we've made over the past 2 months. So when in doubt, if you can, stay home. Avoid gatherings. Wash your hands frequently and thoroughly, and maintain 2 meters distance from everyone else. This is how we will keep fellow Canadians who can't stay home and those working on the front lines safe. I'm now happy to take your questions.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Premier ministre. On va commencer la période de questions par le téléphone aujourd'hui. Opérateur, c'est à vous.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Kate Bolongaro from Bloomberg. Line open.
Hi, Prime Minister. I have a question regarding LEAF. Companies will have to publish how their business ties into the government's sustainability objectives. And I'm wondering, will oil and gas companies be able to fulfill this requirement given the sector's contribution to Canada's CO2 emissions?
We have seen many oil and gas companies make commitments already around net zero by 2050, around understanding that we need to do better in terms of reducing emissions both as a country and as a sector. That's why we're expecting them to put forward a frame within which they will demonstrate their commitments to reducing emissions and fighting climate change. Okay. We
expect everyone to do their share to counter climate change, and we've already seen a number of large companies in the oil sector present plans to achieve net zero by 2050 and fight climate change by lowering their emissions. And we expect any company that accesses this funding to demonstrate that they're going to do that and be part of the solution.
And another key part of these conditions are limitations on executive pay. But what mechanisms are you concretely and pragmatically going to put in place to ensure the appropriate level of executive pay that comes out of this funds, and what is the right amount in your opinion?
We will be sharing the details to come, but the principle is very clear. If a company wants to access this public financing, this taxpayer-funded financing for large employers in order to protect employees across the country, the money has to go to support those employers and not high-paid executives. That's a condition that they will have to abide by if they want to access this financing. We
expect the assistance provided by taxpayers to these large companies to be there to help workers, not senior executives. So we expect any company that wants to access this financing and this assistance to make clear commitments, not to give more money to executives.
Opérateur, prochaine question.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Raymond Filion, TVA. À vous.
Good morning, Prime Minister. I'd like to come back to what you said about Saturday, where you said you were quite concerned about citizens in Montreal with respect to the easing of the lockdown. Can you tell us exactly what you're concerned about? Well, I think there is every reason to be concerned right across the country. People are worried about their parents and grandparents who are in long-term care homes. As Prime Minister, I'm concerned about the whole whole country, and that's why we're taking unprecedented measures to protect Canadians and invest in the economy. As a Quebecer and as the MP for Papineau in Montreal, I am obviously feeling a responsibility and a concern for other citizens. And I'm not only concerned, but I want to work collaboratively with the different levels of government, and we are working very well with the Legault government to ensure that we will be able to protect Quebecers and all Canadians in this pandemic.
I think as we all are, there are things to be concerned about these days. Canadians across the country are worried for their families, for their loved ones, for their communities. As Prime Minister, I'm worried about people across the country. As Member of Parliament for Papineau and a Quebecer, I'm also worried about my fellow Quebecers and the citizens in my riding. That's why it is so important that we continue to work with the Quebec government on our shared goal of ensuring that people get through this as best we possibly can, and we will continue to work hand in hand with the Quebec government on exactly that.
En suivi, Ray?
Follow up.
My
My question had to do with easing the lockdown. As a national leader, are you 100% comfortable with what is happening in Quebec? For example, the reopening of schools starting today. Well, I think it's very important to follow the principles that we set out and ensure that at every step we have enough protection in place and an ability to respond if there is a resurgence of COVID-19. So, of course, I fully respect Quebec in terms of its choices, and we will be working with them to ensure that whatever decisions they make on reopening will be as safe as possible by providing more PPE and ensuring there's a sufficient testing ability, and we'll be there as a partner if they need us.
I think as we move forward, the role of the federal government will be to support provinces in their reopening plans. We will be there to help them make sure that there are enough testing for their levels, that there is more PPE arriving, that we're putting in place measures to follow the guidelines agreed to by all provinces and the federal government on necessary prerequisites to opening.
Thank you. Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Althea Raj, Huffington Post.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Thanks. Do you believe the provinces and territories are currently testing enough people for COVID-19?
I think we need to do more testing right across the country. Last week, we hit our 1 millionth test for Canadians, but there's a lot more to do. We know that as the economy starts to reopen, it's going to be more important to ensure that we have strong testing protocols right across the country. We need to increase the numbers. We've managed to support the provinces on obtaining reagents, on obtaining equipment for it. We need to see more lab capacity opening up, which many provinces have already done in turning to universities and private labs. There's lots more to do on testing, and we need to make sure we're working on that all together. Je pense que c'est nécessaire de faire encore plus de tests de dépistage.
It's really necessary to do more testing. We carried out our 1 millionth test last week, but we need to do more. This is a critical part of reopening the economy. So as a federal government, we will be there to support the provinces and territories so that they can carry out even more testing. And I think that's absolutely essential for the future steps to succeed.
Thank you. So as we begin to reopen the economy and ease restrictions, should testing be available to all who want it?
I think as we've seen throughout this situation, there are very different factors and different situations on the ground across the country. The situation in Prince Edward Island is very different than the situation in British Columbia, which is different from Nunavut and different from Ontario or Quebec. Obviously, every jurisdiction needs to make determinations about what the right and maximal level of testing is that they need, but we will be there as a federal government to encourage them to do as much as they possibly can and make sure that we're helping them access the material needed to do just that.
Thank you. Operator, la dernière question.
Merci. Thank you. De Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir. À vous.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur
Good
Trudeau.
morning, Mr.
Aujourd'hui, au
Trudeau.
Québec,
Today in Quebec, primary schools and daycares are opening up. The government believes that the work environment is safe for them, but there are teachers and educators who are refusing to go back to work. Do you think that those individuals should be able to receive the CERB? Well, that's a very important question, and I think we do have to ensure that in Canada, all across the country, people are able to work safely when they go back. That's what we are working on now with the province of Quebec to ensure that they have not only the necessary rules in place that they will establish, but also that they can reassure people. I know that people are concerned right across the country as we start to ease the lockdown, and I think it's very important for employers to be able to reassure their workers that they can work safely. Follow-up. Yes, but Mr. Trudeau, with all due respect, you're not really answering the question. There are more and more provincial premiers who are concerned about the effect of the CERB on people's desire to go back to work. Brian Pallister and Mr. Legault have said things of that nature. Can you guarantee the provinces that Ottawa will not provide the CERB to workers who could go back to work but who are refusing to do so? The CERB is there to support people who cannot work because of COVID-19. And the priority right now is to protect people, to protect their families. The CERB exists in order to support those individuals. And it is the responsibility of the provinces to ensure that their return to work is safe. We will be there to help them. But the important thing in this circumstance is to ensure that families have the necessary support and that people are safe.
I think it's extremely important to remember that we are still very much in an emergency phase right now, where most of the economy is being in extreme slowdown right now because we have to make sure we're preventing the spread of COVID-19. The Canada Emergency Response Benefit is there to ensure that people can stay safe and support their families at the same time. As people look at going back to work, it will be the responsibility of the employers to demonstrate that situations are safe for people to return to work. The role of the federal government is to support the provinces and other employers in that work, but it's also our role to make sure that families and people are supported to be able to stay safe during this pandemic.
Hi, Prime Minister. Tom Perry with CBC. In your opening address, you talked about this new loan program. You talked about tax avoidance and tax evasion. I get that you don't want to give a loan to a company that's breaking the law to evade taxes, but on tax avoidance, what if you open up the books of a company applying for a loan, you find out they've been doing everything they can to pay as little tax as possible? Do they get a loan?
I think Canadians expect companies that get support from public dollars to have been responsible around paying their fair share of taxes. And certainly if we see situations where someone is engaged in aggressive tax avoidance, we will be putting in conditions or working out a way with them to ensure that they pay their fair share of taxes. Okay.
I think everyone expects large companies to pay their fair share of taxes. And if, looking at the details of their financial statements, we see that they haven't paid their fair share of tax to Canada, we will demand that they make changes in order to receive that public funding.
In your opening address that a lot of oil and gas companies have signed on to net zero commitments. So with the climate requirements in this new loan package, are you trying to freeze out companies that have not made those kinds of commitments?
On the contrary, I think people around the world in financial markets have seen that managing risk is extremely important. We're seeing it with COVID-19, and before we invest in a company, I think it's appropriate to look at what their risk mitigation strategies are. People will be asking about what their risk mitigation strategies for pandemics are as they invest in companies going forward. But we also know that climate change represents a significant significant risk to companies' bottom line as well. So it is perfectly natural for an investor, including public investors like the Government of Canada, to be asking people how they are going to manage the risk of climate change in the coming years.
Brian Mullen, Global News. On today's announcement, strict limits on bonuses and share buybacks is not the same as stopping them. What specific safeguards will be in place to ensure companies don't take advantage?
We will be working very closely with different companies across different sectors to determine the right frame that is right for their industry and business. But Canadians expect that if we're putting public dollars to support financing for companies, that the money goes to support workers. That is the approach with the large employers' emergency financing facility. We need to support workers, and that's not shareholders through dividends. That's not executive bonuses. That is ensuring that everything they're doing is protecting workers, their pensions, their collective bargaining, and the continued operation of this company in the country.
If there aren't safeguards in place, will you consider putting some in place?
I think that is part and parcel of the discussions that we'll have before implementing the LEAF program. We need to make sure that the money is going to support workers every step of the way.
We have to ensure that the money we're giving to these large corporations will be helping employees, not the executives, not investors, but the workers. And we will be introducing measures to ensure that we are there to support workers, their pensions, respect for their collective agreements, and all those aspects, because those companies employ millions of Canadians, and they will have to abide by those rules to access this funding.
From CTV National News. How much is the government willing to spend on these checks to these major companies? And is the government taking on too much risk in this time of a pandemic when we don't know how long it's going to go on for?
I think the significant risk is that we see long-term damage to the Canadian economy, that we see significant large companies that employ millions of Canadians lose their existence, stop functioning because of this pandemic, and millions of Canadians lose their jobs. We need to make sure that we are supporting these employers so that Canadians can continue to have jobs once we bounce back from this pandemic. Of course, we would much prefer that people look onto the private credit markets to get the loans and bridge financing they need, but we will be there as a lender of last resort to ensure that those companies do continue to employ the Canadians across the country who depend on those jobs, but there will be significant conditions around that as well. Okay.
Our priority in this situation is always to ensure that we're there to support workers who are working in many different businesses right across the country. So the important thing is to prevent these companies from failing, which would cause serious damage to the Canadian economy. Of course, we would prefer that these companies find private financing, but if they cannot find it because of the pandemic, we will be there to support them during these difficult times.
Over the weekend, South Korea saw an outbreak related to a nightclub there. Obviously, we are still don't have nightclubs open here, but it does show how quickly outbreaks can happen, and they've decided to postpone opening schools. Today, schools outside of Montreal are now opening in Quebec. Are you willing to put any pressure on premiers across the country to tell them to slow down right now, given how you've said we're still in an emergency phase?
I think we're all feeling pressure from Canadians to get this right. And we understand that the sacrifices we've all made for the past 2 months of staying home, of self-isolating, of keeping 2 meters distance, of not seeing parents and grandparents, could all go up in smoke if we move too quickly on reopening or if a given jurisdiction makes the wrong decisions. That's why being cautious and gradual and vigilant is essential for how we move forward on the gradual reopening. And that's why Canadians across the country are looking very carefully at all orders of government and the decisions they make, and will be held to account if reopening happens too quickly and Canadians have to lock down once again in a few weeks because people were overeager to get the economy going. We have to get that balance right, and that means being cautious, and we will continue to be pushing for caution as we move progressively towards reopening the economy.
Bonjour, Monsieur Trudeau, Christian Noël de
Good
Radio-Canada.
morning, Mr. Trudeau.
Aujourd'hui,
Christian Noël,
l'aide que vous
Radio-Canada.
annoncez, c'est sous
Today,
forme
the
de prêts et de
assistance
garanties.
you are offering is loans and guaranteed loans. Now, is this the final measure that will be there for large companies? And how long can a government support an economy so considerably? For how long can that happen? Well, we're in a very difficult situation now, and we just don't have any previous experience to rely on, so we know exactly how things will work. So we have to make the best decisions possible, and as we've been doing from the outset, we've been announcing new programs, and if there's a need to extend them or shorten them or adjust them, we will do that. At every step of the way, we are guided by two principles. First of all, keeping Canadians healthy and safe. Second, allowing the Canadian economy to bounce back and fire up again in the coming days. But of course, we have to take our time and adjust as things evolve. And this is a major announcement we're making today to support large employers, and we may have other announcements to make at further steps along the way. But all the time, we're trying to maximize the impact of the measures that we've already announced so that we can begin to start up the economy again, and so that the government can do less and less as we move forward.
Throughout this pandemic, we have been guided by two strong principles. One is protect the health and safety of Canadians. And second in order of importance, is ensure that our economy is able to bounce back quickly and strongly once all this is over. That means doing things strongly right now to support people, but also make sure that there is an economy to come back to once we do start reopening and life starts to get back to normal. So what we've announced today with the large employer emergency financing facility, the LEAF, will be a significant help to significant employers right across the country. There may be more steps we have to take. We don't know what the next possible steps are that we're going to need. We're going to stay open and flexible to adjusting the programs we put forward, to stretching them out, to condensing them, to combining them. We've demonstrated every step of the way that we're figuring out what works best, and if something doesn't work great, we'll pull it back and tweak it and try and put it out in a different way. We're in an unprecedented situation, but every step of the way, we will do what is necessary to protect Canadians and to ensure that we have an economy to go back to.
J'essaie de comprendre un peu où vous êtes
I'm trying
rendu
to
dans votre projection
understand
d'aide
where
qui va
you
devoir
are in
être
terms
faite.
of your projections of the kind of assistance that will be needed. You have announced billions of dollars that is being given to companies, but today these are loan guarantees that will have to be paid back. Is this because you think that we're coming to the end of our ability to bring out billions of dollars every other day? No, this announcement is part of a gradual series of measures which are there to help companies and employees that have lost their job. We wanted to put money directly into people's pockets. Now, for small businesses, we provided loans under very positive conditions that cost practically nothing to help them out. Now, mid-sized companies, they require a bit more in terms of the size of those loans, and for large companies, that funding will cost even more because they have access to a level of credit that workers and individuals and small businesses do not. So we're providing loans to these large companies because our priority is to help as many individuals and workers as possible in this country. And we expect the large companies to be able to get along as much as possible through the financial markets they already have access to.
Merci tout le monde.
All right, that is the Prime Minister of Canada on this Monday, in case you were worried about what day of the week it is, giving us really more answers around the major announcement from the government today. That is that it will allow bridge financing, it will offer bridge financing for large and medium-sized companies. And by large, we really do mean quite large. It has to be in the order of revenue of $300 million. So this is not the small and medium-sized businesses that the government has previously targeted. I'll bring in Vashi and David to help us go through some of this. One of the things there that stood out for me was when the Prime Minister said that the preference would be for private banks and financial institutions to pony up the liquidity here for companies, but the government is a lender of last resort, which leads me to wonder what kind of difficulties companies are actually running into when they knock on the door of their financial institutions if the government feels it has to step in this way. I think there's lots of questions I would have there for companies about how receptive financial institutions are right now, given that the government has had to step in here, Vashi.
Yeah, the exact same thing jumped out to me in that term, especially we are trying to be a lender of last resort. Why are companies at the last resort? Is it a question of the amount? Is it that some of these companies just need in excess of what banks are willing to give? But even still, I think there are genuine questions for those financial institutions about that. I think we need more specifics in order to sort of ascertain why. And the big question for me is around how much money. It persists as a question because it's my understanding that that is the biggest question coming out of the patch today. So we were kind of musing prior to the press conference if, though this isn't directed specifically at that sector, for example, or specifically at the airline sector, would it be of benefit to them? And the number one question for them is there sort of a maximum on the amount of money that the government will lend to these bigger companies? If you think of airlines, I mean, in the United States, there's a mixture of bailout and loans for airlines in the neighborhood, I think, of about $25 billion. Obviously, we're a smaller economy, but our airlines are big companies. How much money are we talking? I think that's the one thing I was left wondering, and I know a lot of that depends on exactly what the needs of these specific companies are going to be. But again, the estimate out of Alberta and out of the oil patch there was at least $20 billion. In excess of $20 billion in liquidity is needed for these bigger companies. So at the end of the day, is the federal government, going to be loaning out $40 billion, $30 billion? Those are big numbers, right? Huge numbers, actually. And it's a loan. And the Prime Minister, was explicit about that. This isn't a bailout. It's a loan. It's not a blank check. But I think that those kinds of numbers are going to be interesting. And they also give us a better gauge on how effective this will be for those sectors which were particularly hard hit. I would also just sort of underscore all of that with, again, lots of questions about the strings attached to this money. And though the government is being clear that there are strings, for example, around limiting executive pay, the details, the Prime Minister admitted, aren't available yet. So they'll be providing them in the coming days. Those details, that fine print, I think is going to be pretty important to Canadians if we are on the hook for $20 or $30 billion.
Yeah, he did say, however, and I hadn't heard this when I was listening to Bill Morneau, that they will have to share their complete financial structure with the government. So, a company would really have to not have any access to private liquidity, be comfortable opening up their books to the government in that way because they are in a desperate place. I think there's some trade-offs there that would make it, I don't know, some companies maybe want to make sure that they don't go down that road, while other companies, as you point out, Vashi, probably don't have any choice at all. But that to me was an interesting caveat that I hadn't heard either. David.
Yeah, three things kind of jump out at me here, Rosie. One is about this whole idea of the government being the lender of last resort. Obviously, a lot of companies are going to be able to get money from conventional banks, but there is a limit to the risk tolerance that a bank is going to have, or any financial institution is going to have, when every company in the country is going through a difficult time and may be coming for bridge financing and support from the lending institutions. there's only so much risky debt a bank is willing to take on, and this is where the backstop of the government of Canada needs to come in. The second is the point you just mentioned on if you do come in and you need to disclose your entire financial structure, and they're going to take a hard look at it. If they find out you're doing tax avoidance measures like moving to low tax jurisdictions to avoid paying the full share in Canada, they will put some conditions on that and maybe work with you on a restructuring to start paying a fairer and better share of Canadian taxation. So there's a negotiation like there is in any loan, but it's not simply on repayment terms and conditions, it's on operating terms and conditions, and also on restructuring terms and conditions. And the third thing that jumped out to me, Rosie, and it wasn't about this program announced today, it was about the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. The Prime Minister and other people have been asked about this again and again and again. Some premiers are agitating and some private sector people are agitating that the CERB is a disincentive for people to go to work. People are being told they can go back to work. They feel it's not safe. They're not going. And the Prime Minister was asked directly if he would cut off the CERB for people like that. They're not touching that at all. The sense you get is they're willing to let the premiers drive the reopening based on the local data and the local conditions in their jurisdictions. But the Prime Minister has been asked about this enough that it's pretty clear they are going to take no steps at the federal level, at least for now, to create financial stress and pressure on workers to go back to work. There is no talk of changing the CERB from him to incentivize people to come off the benefit and go back to work if they do not feel safe. So that is potentially an interesting tension point going ahead.
Yeah, that's true, David, but he also is not able to say that if you aren't feeling safe to go back to work, that you can keep collecting the CERB and that will be fine for your employer. I mean, I think that's
so the status quo holds is essentially it, right? They're not going to do anything to push people off that benefit and back into a workplace. That's going to be something that has to be managed between the employer and the employee.
Yeah, which will be, I think, the tension point, I think, possibly for people, because there are people who just don't feel safe. I just want to touch on the climate change point too, Vashi, before we take a break, because I found the Prime Minister's answer interesting as well around the idea of managing risk, and that in the future we'll have to manage risk around pandemics if this is our new life. But in this case, it makes sense to manage risk around climate change, which obviously isn't top of mind for everyone right now.
Yeah, not necessarily top of mind, but it also does tie into the announcement that was made today, especially as we discuss, and we have been discussing the potential for the oil sector to be able to access this bridge financing, some caveats, sort of some constrictions around what they'll have to show, or the climate plan that they have, if that fits into the larger picture, but not necessarily clear about what happens if a company doesn't, or I don't even know what would qualify them as not at this point. Those details are all pretty much missing as well at this point, but obviously some sensitivity, as David pointed out later, to the issue and how it all factors into this loan program.
Okay, thank you both very much for your help with our coverage. We'll talk in the next hour, if you don't mind, as we stand by and wait for cabinet ministers to brief us today, as well as federal public health officials on the picture of COVID-19 across this country. But the major announcement from the government coming at much earlier today at 9:30 as the markets open, that the government will now provide this large employer financing, essentially a large amount of bridge financing for big companies like airline companies, oil and gas industry, and anyone else that needs a big government-backed loan to get them through this difficult period of the pandemic. We're going to take a short break here. More on CBC News Network straight ahead. I'm Rosemary Barton. See you in a minute. Hi again, I'm Rosemary Barton here in Ottawa. Thanks for joining us on CBC News Network, streaming around the world, wherever you might be. Ottawa rolls out plans to help more businesses cope with the economic shock from the pandemic. The Prime Minister gave us more details about the expansion of an emergency credit, a large employer financing facility, essentially the government providing money to large companies to help them weather the storm and indeed protect the jobs for millions of Canadians. He did emphasize that it's a bridge loan. It's not a bailout, and we'll talk more with our reporters about that. Of course, we are standing by to bring you the daily federal briefing with cabinet ministers and public health officials. That starts in just moments. But before we do that, I want to make sure to get to our next guest. Alex Pourbaix is the CEO of Cenovus Energy, and he joins me on the phone now. We tried FaceTime, but we ended up with the phone. Mr. Pourbaix, so nice of you to make the time. Thank you so much.
Oh, no problem at all, Rosemary. Thanks for checking in.
So I guess I want to know, first of all, whether this announcement today, this new financing facility, LEAF as the government is calling it, is something that your company is interested in tapping into.
We've really only seen those headline comments and the announcement. So I know the government is still working on the details. We'll take a very close look at it as it comes out. I think, from our perspective, we went into this with a very significant amount of liquidity already available to us. So we'll certainly take a look at it, and it's probably a little bit early to know if we would avail ourselves of it.
So does that mean you basically don't need it? You're one of the companies that is doing okay?
Well, I mean, I think you got to be careful about using the term okay. The price for WTI today is about $24.50. But, as I said, we went into it. We were in a pretty good position with a great deal of liquidity. But at these kind of prices, the oil industry doesn't work for any oil producer on the planet at these levels, and all of us will be increasing our debt until we see prices improve. So I think everyone's going to take a pretty hard look at it.
Obviously, the Premier there was asking for, I don't know if bailout's the right word, but he did want something on par with what the auto sector was given. This is really about lending money and bridge financing. Do you think that that's going to be adequate, if not for your company, but for the industry in a more general way?
The federal government has already come out with some liquidity assistance for what I would call the smaller end of the industry, and I think it was great news to hear them come out with something that recognizes that the large industry players also are really affected, and frankly, it's those large industry players with their significant production that is going to help the economy come out of this. So no, I think it's definitely helpful now. There's something for all range of producers.
One of the things that the Prime Minister said was that the government was really a lender of last resort, which made me question whether financial institutions are not able to put forward liquidity for most businesses. Again, this isn't your case, but are you hearing that is a problem, that banks don't simply feel comfortable providing further liquidity to major companies?
I think no. I mean, my experience is the Canadian banks in particular have generally been doing everything they can. But I think one of the challenges with the commodity price as low as it is right now, albeit for hopefully a relatively short period of time, I mean, I think there's only so much lending that the banks can do with that kind of collateral, just with the lower prices. So I think the combination of the banks and with the government support hopefully will be very helpful to see this industry through to the other side, where it can help lead the recovery.
You may have heard as well that this new bridge financing does have this climate change component where you have to be actively working towards the government's the national climate targets as well. Cenovus, again, one of the companies that has been ahead of some of that. But is that generally something that would be comfortable for the industry to make that part of the condition of bridge financing?
Yeah, I think, I can only speak on behalf of our company, but I mean, I know we have been reporting, in compliance with the government's task force for, I think, going on 3 years. And you alluded to the fact that we have already made very significant commitments to improve our GHG intensity over the next decade. So, I mean, that's nothing that's particularly worrisome to us. And I know that most of our competitors have done the same thing. So I think the industry has that issue certainly in its sights, and I think everybody is largely moving in that direction.
This is obviously so different from 2008, 2009 because of the fact that we've had to sort of shut down the economy, but the oil industry had been affected by the low price in oils, by this dispute between Russia and Saudi Arabia. I mean, it was really the worst of the worst of the worst for the oil and gas industry, the oil industry in particular. How are you approaching it differently because it is such an unprecedented kind of event? And do you think you will be able to come out the other side and be doing the same kind of business you were before?
Yeah, Rosemary. I mean, my own view on that is that this is an extraordinary situation. I can't recall if it's 2 black swans or 3 black swans, but I fundamentally do not believe that when the world comes out of this in whether it's 2 months, 6 months, or 8 months, I don't believe that the fundamental reliance on oil and gas is going to change. I think people will be driving cars, and I think people will eventually get on planes. And we're already seeing, for example, in China, who is obviously much further ahead in their recovery, we're seeing refined product demand getting back to where it was before the pandemic. So I do think we're going to get back there, and I think as long as companies have access to temporary liquidity to get them through this short, sharp period, I think you will see the oil and gas industry be one of the industries that drives the recovery as we come out of this.
One last question to you. Last week, there was a lot of noise made in Alberta. The Premier was not happy. The Green Party interim leader, or the House leader, Elizabeth May, and the Bloc leader also talked about the oil sector being dead after this, that it was time to put it out to pasture. Obviously, it accounts for a 10% of Canada's GDP and employs a lot of people. But what was your reaction when you heard even that notion being thrown around that this is perhaps the time to dramatically shift in a different direction?
I mean, that's it. I just think on its face, it's a ridiculous comment, Rosemary. If you look at the 08-09 crisis, it was actually the Canadian oil and gas sector which led the Canadian economy back. We employ over 800,000 Canadians, 14,000 Indigenous people, and in 2019 we contributed $108 million to Canada's GDP. To suggest that this is a sunset industry is just it's not a serious comment. And when we come out of this, the Canadian government is going to need revenue sources to take on this incredible deficit that we've had to take on to deal with the pandemic. And I think it's going to be incredibly important that the largest industry in the country is healthy and able to contribute and continue to provide revenue to the government as we have for the last 50 or 60 years.
Just quickly, Mr. Pourbaix, have you had to furlough or lay off employees? Can you just give me a sense of what has happened on that front for your company?
No, what we did is, rather than do that, we asked all of our employees all the way up to myself and the board, took increasing levels of pay cuts, and we have kept all of our full-time employees working, albeit with modest pay cuts.
Okay. Alex Pourbaix, thank you so much for making the time. I really appreciate it, sir. Important to get your voice in today. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks, Rosemary.
Okay, take care. That's the CEO of Cenovus Energy, and we're going to go right now to the federal briefing happening here in Ottawa with the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland.
Canada, who do exceptional work every day, particularly in the fight against this pandemic. Thank you for everything you do to keep us healthy and safe. You are our real heroes.
So, to all of Canada's frontline healthcare workers, we know that this is a particularly challenging time. This is National Nursing Week, and I'd like to thank all of the nurses across Canada who are doing exceptional work every day, and in particular during this fight against the global pandemic. Thank you for everything that you do to keep us safe and healthy. You are true heroes, and we appreciate it so much. So today we will hear from Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, the Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Howard New, the President
of the Treasury Board, Mr. Duclos.
Patty Haidu is here to answer your questions as well. Dr. Tam, please.
Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone.
With the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada, there are now 69,156 confirmed cases, including 4,906 deaths, and over 32,400, or 47%, have now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,118,000 people for COVID-19 to date, with about 6% of these testing positive. In the past week, we've tested an average of 26,000 people daily. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on canada.ca/coronavirus. We are at the start of another week after celebrating our mothers and caregivers, whether with us in our home, just a virtual connection away, or beloved and unforgettable in our memories. We all share the understanding of the power of their nurturing. So my weekend reflection was on the fundamental human need for this most powerful force of good. Nurturing is that silent catalyst that speeds up the healing of our cuts and scrapes, calms our fears, and gives us reassurance that everything will be okay. This brings me to a very special week of recognition and acknowledgement of some of the other important nurturers in our society. Today marks the beginning of National Nursing Week. We all know that nurses deliver expert care with that special power of nurturing, and we have been very aware of the many sacrifices they have made to be there for their patients in every area of healthcare during this crisis. But their expertise and impact goes far beyond this, spanning every area of health services, from education to the development of standards and guidelines, the delivery of public health programs like vaccination, the implementation of infection prevention and control, and contributing to research and innovation. Nurses contribute to wellness everywhere, and we are also very much better for it. So this week, let's all thank Canada's nurses. Join a 7 p.m. cheer from your driveway. Draw a thank you sign for healthcare heroes in your community, or shine a light in a window for all nurses on Tuesday night, because Tuesday nurses everywhere are commemorating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized the field of nursing. It was a revolution that started small, implementing hand washing and hygiene practices to save lives by preventing the spread of life-threatening infections. Then slowly, but with unshakable purpose, she raised the standards and profile of nursing and put an indelible focus on the education of nurses. So in appreciation for the nurturing, daily sacrifices, deep expertise, and unshakable professionalism of nurses everywhere, shine a light in your window on Tuesday night. Thank you. Merci.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Tam. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à Dr.
And now I give the floor to Dr. New.
Merci. Et bonjour.
Thank you. Hello. As usual, I will start with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 69,156 confirmed cases, including 4,906 deaths and 3,100 and roughly 47% now recovered. Labs across Canada have tested over 1,118,000 people for COVID-19, with about 6% of these roughly testing positive. In the last week, we've tested on average 26,000 people daily. These numbers change quickly and are updated regularly on Canada.ca/coronavirus. We're at the start of another week after celebrating our mothers and caregivers, whether with us in our home, just a virtual connection away, or beloved and unforgettable in our memories. We all share the understanding of the power of their nurturing. So my weekend reflection was on the fundamental human need for this most powerful force of good. Nurturing is that silent catalyst that speeds up the healing of our cuts and scrapes, calms our fears, and gives us reassurance that everything will be okay. This brings me to a very special week of recognition and acknowledgement as some of the other important nurturers in our society. Today marks the beginning of National Nursing Week. We all know that nurses deliver expert care with that special power of nurturing, and we have been very aware of the many sacrifices they have made to be there for their patients in every area of healthcare during this crisis. However, their expertise and impact goes far beyond this, spanning every area of health services, from education to the development of standards and guidelines, the delivery of public health care programs like immunization, the implementation of infection prevention and control, and contributing to research and innovation. Nurses contribute to wellness everywhere, and we are all so much better for it. So this week, let's all thank Canada's nurses. Join a 7 p.m. cheer from your driveway. Draw a thank you sign for healthcare heroes in your community. Or shine a light in a window for all nurses on Tuesday night. Why Tuesday? Because nurses everywhere are commemorating the 200th anniversary of the birth of Florence Nightingale, who revolutionized the field of nursing. It was a revolution that started small, implementing hand washing and hygiene practices to save lives by preventing the spread of life-threatening infections. Then slowly, but with unshakable purpose, she raised the standards and profile of nursing and put an indelible focus on the education of nurses. So, in appreciation for the nurturing, daily sacrifices, deep expertise, and unshakable professionalism of nurses everywhere, shine light in your window on Tuesday night. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. New. Et maintenant, je donne
Thank you, Dr. New. And now I give the floor to Mr. Duclos. Thank you, Christian. Hello, everyone. The Prime Minister's main message today was about protection, keeping people safe, and also establishing a new credit program for large corporations. It is to protect workers and to ensure that their collective agreements are respected, and it is an investment plan to guarantee jobs, given the situation we're living through. And second, we want to establish a solid mechanism, given the situation we're facing, for landowners and managers. We want to avoid companies from going bankrupt. We want to ensure their pension plans are properly managed. And also, We want to protect the resilience of our economy when we do restart our economy, and we hope this will be lasting, and we need to ensure that large corporations will be supported, but we'll show that they're fighting climate change and have solid environmental measures in place. And they have to guarantee that they're maintaining supply chains, and also with small and medium-sized companies. They are the very fabric of our economy. So all of this is part of the emergency plan that is both fair and transparent and universal. Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much, Jean-Yves. We're happy to answer your questions now. Thank you.
Just a reminder that we have a hard stop at 1 p.m. today, so we'll start on the phone with 3 questions, 1 question, 1 follow-up, and then we'll turn to the room. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Our first question, notre première question, nous vient de l'inaudible avec la presse canadienne. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour.
Hello, Mr. Duclos. Can you explain the logic behind this support for large corporations in the airline sector, for example? We know that their medium or short-term future may be difficult given the situation. What guarantees can you give that all this money that is going to be spent on these companies and keeping them afloat won't just be for naught, because they will be doing layoffs, they've had to cut business? Answer. These are emergency loans. They're not blank checks. So these loans will be offered to ensure that we can support a transition from this crisis to avoid some of these large corporations from having to shut their doors and lay off thousands of workers. And they won't have to also cut supply chains that are very important between these large corporations and small and mid-sized companies. As I said, they are the very fabric of our economic growth and economy in Canada, and notably in Quebec. So we have to ensure that we protect our economic fabric throughout this crisis, which we need to restart our economy. And we know that this involves notably an emergency loan plan for some of these large corporations. It's not a blank check, and in most cases, these large companies will prefer to continue to get liquidity from traditional financial markets, but they should be able to turn to Canadian government in some conditions, but there will be requirements that will be in place. Question. Thank you. I understood that these were loans, Mr. Duclos, but I'd like for you to explain what will be happening for airlines. Will government be giving companies funding to airlines? We've seen automotive companies that did not pay back government loans. What is the logic behind helping these companies financially, particularly airlines, when we know that in the short and medium term and even the longer term, that they will have less and less business? Answer. One thing that is clear that you say very well, in the short term, we know very well that these airlines will continue to see sizable losses. But we know in the longer term, we will need solid airlines in Canada. And from a structural and a national perspective, these airlines and transporters in general will play a major role to protect the fabric of our Canadian economy. And it is very important to protect airlines and transporters in Canada. We need them to be solid so that one day we'll be able to get out of this crisis. Thank you. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Ryan Tumulty avec le National Post. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Yeah, hi there. This question's for Dr. Tam or perhaps Minister Hajdu. I'm working on a story, and I've been talking to people in the health industry here about Canada's ability to produce large quantities of vaccine when or if one is found for COVID-19. I'm wondering if that's a concern for you, if you think the resources are here. I know Canada does produce a lot of vaccine, but those markets are, those factories are already full of other orders.
Well, thank you very much for the question. And in fact, that's part of the work that we've been doing in terms of working with promising companies across the country, particularly when it comes to vaccine production. Certainly, we have a ways to go. As you know, there is quite a bit of work to do in the space of vaccine creation and then production, but that is certainly something that we're working on. And my colleague, Minister Baines, has been extremely active in this space, making sure that Canadian companies who have either the capacity or the desire to do that have the supports from our government to quickly ramp up. Maybe I'll turn to Dr. Tam to speak a little bit more about where the international community is at in terms of vaccine development.
Well, I think we're still in this sort of relatively early stage where there's a lot of research, which is great news. So I would say over 100 sort of different candidates being looked at right now as potentials, some going into sort of early stage clinical trials. So it is still early stage. But nonetheless, we are engaging all the capacities in Canada to have a look at what is in the realm of the possible. So you don't actually have a sort of lead candidate vaccine yet, but we are absolutely monitoring every one of these and looking at domestic capabilities linked to it. So it is a very rapidly evolving setting, but we're also looking at all the way downstream to, well, when you actually have to vaccinate the population, you have to look at all the supply. So really the whole pipeline from beginning to end is being looked at from a preparedness perspective. But right now, you can't actually say, here is the vaccine that is going to be the most successful. That is still undergoing evolution globally, but we're part of that research internationally. So I think, I think we need to look at every option. Some of the investments that Canada puts in may not pan out to be, in the end, a successful candidate, but we still need to contribute right now and maximize all of our options.
Ryan, follow up?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask too, when I spoke with people in the industry, they say, for example, Canada makes most of its own flu vaccine every year, but there's obviously, well, only about 40% of Canadians get the flu vaccine, so this order would be presumably much larger, but also those factories are tied up making that flu vaccine. I'm wondering if, as a public health measure, you'd consider reducing the amount of flu vaccine we make one year to be able to make more COVID vaccine, should we get there, obviously.
I think, it's dangerous to think about things in a zero-sum way like that. I think we can't keep our eye off influenza as highly contagious and also leading to thousands of deaths across Canada. And of course, coincidement of the flu season with a second spike of COVID, for example, could be very difficult for our healthcare system. So from my perspective as health minister, I don't think what we would want to be in the position of having to do is decrease the production of an extremely valuable, extremely important vaccine to increase the production of another. What we're looking to do is expand the capacity and have companies across Canada that can produce, the potential COVID vaccine. I'll also just point out that I think it's really important that we work with the international community on the COVID vaccine. As we know, no country is safe as long as there is one case of COVID, and so Canada has been aggressively working in partnership and including contributing financial resources to the acceleration of discovering a vaccine and the eventual production of one.
I would just add that it's not a very simple analysis, because the COVID-19 vaccine, whichever is a potential candidate, may not be grown on the same platform as the influenza vaccine. So, for example, if you have an egg-based influenza vaccine platform, that might not be how your COVID-19 vaccine is going to be produced. So it depends on the technology as well.
Thank you, Dr. Operator. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Raymond Fillon avec TVA. Please go ahead. Your line is now open. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon. I have a question for Mr. Duclos. I'd like to follow up on a question that was asked earlier by a colleague to the Prime Minister about the easing of the lockdown. In case of doubt, should we stay at home? Do we have doubts about security? And can I, if I do, and I don't want to go to work, can I continue to receive the curb? Answer. We are in a question where there are big doubts and safety is at question. There are a lot of households, and this is on the mind of many workers. There are basic rules. We have to have a good relationship with our worker, and in appropriate cases, we may need help from public officials in provinces so that we can allay fears with and by working with employers. That's the main objective. We want to ensure the safety of workers and also the feeling they have of being safe at work. A large part of our individual well-being depends on our well-being at work. And in this difficult context, which creates both doubts and insecurity, workers need to be supported by their workers, and they expect appropriate measures in this work situation. Question. If the school or the factory where I work opens its doors, I have to reach an agreement with my employer. But at the end of the line, who knows if I'm eligible for the CERB if I refuse to go to work because I don't think it's safe and I have fears? Answer. You say quite correctly, if I feel that there are health and safety issues at work, I also have the responsibility to talk about this with my employer and to talk about with health officials and experts. If the response is not as satisfactory as I want as a worker, if the basic condition and the employer-employee relationship, well, it should be done correctly. In that case, the CERB is there to help and support millions of workers financially who do not have the ability to be at work safely with what I've just said, or if they have to take care of a child at home, or if they've lost their job because of COVID-19. Thank you very much. A question from a room now.
Mr. Hajdu, we just had Mental Health Week, and I'm wondering, how concerned are you about a secondary mental health, like echo pandemic, that could happen because of all this?
Well, thank you very much, Mike, and it's a great question. We did just have Mental Health Week, and we know that it's not just a secondary wave. It's actually happening right now, that many Canadians are experiencing distress in proportions that we haven't seen in a very long time, whether it's anxiety or depression, increased domestic violence, increased substance use. And that's why we've been so focused on making sure that we don't wait until the resolution of the pandemic to provide resources, but rather they're available right now. And I've talked quite a bit about those resources. I'll just remind Canadians that you can have access to free support through the Wellness Together portal, available through canada.ca/coronavirus. But also that site has a number of useful self-assessment tools, resources that you can use on your own, and then connections to paid professionals, whether it's by text or phone. We've also increased money to transfer to provinces and territories, and for both treatment, by the way, as well as mental health supports. And that's in addition to our previous contribution through transfer increases in the last mandate. But there will be more to do. And we know that this secondary pandemic, if you will, is just as, in many ways, as a matter of fact, I would say it's just as urgent as this one. Because, of course, people are struggling for a whole bunch of reasons, including our young people. And we need to be all focused at every level of government to help people manage through these difficult times.
Thank you. And you talked about the Wellness Together portal, and I'm just wondering, does it have enough supports there? Do we need to do other stuff? Is there enough funding? Is there anything else we could do better?
So far, I've heard good things about the Wellness Together portal, and I know that provinces and territories also have their own digital and online tools, as well as access through a variety of different means to professionals in their own jurisdictions. I think there's always more to do to understand what's working and what's not working, and I think the challenge, having come from this sector in some ways in my past, the challenge is that oftentimes there isn't the diversity of tools available for people. For example, the way that we treat substance use is pretty standard, and there are a few different diversions of ways to treat substance use, but there's not the variety that exists that necessarily meets people where they're at. And that work has to continue. And I'm looking forward to having those more fulsome conversations with other provinces, with territories, with providers about how we can all do a better job talking about mental health and mental wellness. I think we also have to, as a society, continue to work on breaking down barriers to talk about mental health in a way that doesn't create that barrier of stigma that still exists for people to talk about how they're feeling. I mean, many people are feeling sad and lonely and scared, and those are okay feelings and very normal feelings to have. And so I think we have to continue to encourage one another to reach out and to speak to our families, our friends, and professionals when we need to. Thank you.
Rachel?
Rachel Haynes from CTV National News. My first question is for Minister Hajdu and Dr. Tam. Schools in some areas of Quebec are opening today, even though the numbers there are still relatively high. How concerned are you that kids right now are going to be used as guinea pigs in this reopening that we're seeing, and does that concern you?
Well, I think as we've all said, and all the chief medical officers agree, you have to do things slowly and cautiously. So I think the Quebec Public Health authorities, I'm sure, monitoring this extremely closely to see what the initial school opening would be like from a COVID-19 perspective. But as we just talked about mental health and other aspects of secondary effects, they're also monitoring, that side of things too, not just illness. And it's a complex piece of decision making, but also it's in some ways, have to support parents and individuals for making that decision, and also teachers. And so kids are connected to teachers and their families could be connected to grandparents, for example. So individual situations of risk, I think, are actually a bit different, and that needs to be looked at a more local level. But for sure, I think we know that children on the whole, particularly younger kids, do exhibit milder symptoms and have less of a severe outcome. So I think that goes into one aspect of it, but it is, I know, is a balancing between that and the need for kids, particularly vulnerable kids. I think that's, I know that in the public health domain, people are concerned that closing down schools can only impact those most vulnerable the most. So those are the kids, I think, that they're most seized with. The other thing is that children of essential service workers as well that need maybe some support from a school perspective.
Minister Hajdu, do you have anything to add?
I think Dr. Tam's covered it well. Thanks.
And as a follow-up too, we are seeing some very large cities that are opening up, like Toronto for some curbside pickup. But there are still, again, high number of cases there, more so than in other places of the country where they are not reopening yet. Even New Brunswick had pushed back some days of school opening. So are you concerned about this perhaps imbalance of openings that we're seeing across the country?
Well, thank you very much. I think that each jurisdiction is using the guidance framework that the provinces and territories with the Prime Minister worked out to make their own jurisdictional decisions based on the complexity of considerations that Dr. Tam has outlined. These are difficult decisions, and of course, premiers and local politicians are weighing decisions about how to resume some functioning of their communities while also protecting people's wellness. And I think, as Dr. Tam's talked about, the decisions are being driven through epidemiology that's very local in its context and through a risk assessment process at the provincial level. And I think when Dr. Tam talked a couple weeks ago about the downside, coming down the curve, coming down the peak. I think that's where we're at. I think all premiers and all municipal leaders understand that there will be a period of adjustment and that we will have to be taking these decisions, carefully monitoring the outcomes of these decisions and adjusting them. And I think we can anticipate that there will be adjustments as we go through the next phase. Because, of course, this is a whole new way of behaving, not just for leaders, but also for the citizens that live in those communities. I think there are some very simple messages that Canadians can take with them always, no matter which jurisdiction, which is wash your hands, don't go anywhere if you're sick, and make sure you keep your distance, your 2-meter distance from people, and give people distance when you're out in the community. And I think that will help also to reduce risk for community. Thank you.
Tonda?
Good morning. Minister Freeland, the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, on Friday was very adamant. He doesn't want to see the U.S. border reopened anytime soon. Can you address his concerns about that, and given that the agreement, I guess, comes up in a week? And very specifically, he said, and if you go about relaxing restrictions at borders for travel, there needs to be tenfold screening at airports and whatnot. So what plan has your government got in place to address those concerns?
Thanks for the question, Tonda. We had a very good conversation with the premiers on Thursday at the now weekly First Minister's call about borders in general and the Canada-US border in particular. We are really daily, even hourly, reviewing and working on and monitoring the border situation with our U.S. partners. The Prime Minister was very clear today, as he is every day, that we believe in acting out of an abundance of caution, that we believe it's very important not to squander the gains that Canadians have sacrificed so much to achieve. And we are going to be taking that prudent and careful approach when it comes to reviewing our border agreement with the United States. The premiers, very much including Premier Ford, offered some very useful input in the conversation on Thursday, and we're having ongoing conversations with the Americans.
I'm not sure that was an answer, but okay.
Yeah, no, Tonda, actually, that was an answer. What I said was that we are working closely with the Americans, that we're taking a cautious and careful approach. And we had a great and very useful conversation with the premiers who, by and large, share this cautious view.
So is there a need for tenfold increase in screening at borders, as Premier
So
Ford
when it comes to the second part of your question, actual measures that are in place at the border, right now the situation is working well. In fact, I think particularly at the Canada-US border, the distinction between essential and non-essential travel has managed to achieve our two objectives of keeping Canadians safe and at the same time allowing those essential goods and services to continue moving freely across the border. So that has worked and that is working. Of course, inevitably, as our economy starts to open up, something that we've been talking about today, even absent a single change in Canada's border restrictions, we will see more travel across the border. We'll see more Canadians choosing to go back and forth, and we'll see more business activity, which will mean more essential travel. And that does mean that the federal government will need to do even more at all of our borders to keep Canadians safe and well. And that is something that we are working on right now and we're very focused on.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We'll now go back to the phone for 3 questions. Operator.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question nous vient de Hélène Buzetti avec Le Devoir. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Oui, bonjour, Monsieur Duclos. Good afternoon, Mr. Duclos. I'd like to go back about the question you were asked earlier. My colleague from TVA asked you about something. We're restarting the economy. There are employers that are calling their workers back, and in some cases, workers don't think things are safe. I understand that you are trying to encourage a conversation between employers and employees about work safety, but if they don't reach a mutual understanding and the worker still doesn't want to go back to work, should they receive the CERB or not? Answer. Thank you for your question. The CERB is there to help workers in 3 types of circumstances. First, if the worker has lost their job because of COVID-19. Second, if this person needs to take care of a child at home. And third, if this person needs help to ensure their health and safety. And that is what the employer-worker relationship reposes on. The employer has the responsibility not only to guarantee the health and safety of the worker at their normal workplace, but also they have to ensure that that worker has the feeling and the reassurance of safety and that their health will also be protected. In all cases, this reassurance and this feeling depends on an important conversation between the worker and the employer. And as I said, this conversation may need to be supported by directives and additional information from health officials and health and safety officials across the country and notably in Quebec. So it really depends on an individual context. Question. You're still not answering my question, so I'm not going to lose my time talking more about that. But I'd like to hear what you have to hear about the student CERB. The bill was adopted almost 2 weeks ago. There's a certain amount of latitude being taken. We've heard that students will be given available jobs and that they'll be able to earn a certain amount of money and still receive this assistance. Do you have anything more to say about that? Answer. 2 things. The emergency support for students is offered in a much broader context. There are solid measures to increase jobs available for students. Many students will have a hard time finding a job. They'd like to find one rather than receiving the CERB for students. And therefore, we established measures to support internships, volunteer work for students, so that we can support community organizations. There's the Canada Summer Job Program. So there are certain measures that will be there to enhance jobs, increase the jobs that are available, but there will still be some students that won't be able to work in coming months. So the second thing that will soon be done in cooperation with Madame Le Boutillier, the Minister of Revenue, and Ms. Qualtrough, the Minister of Employment, is to announce on a site that will be on the CERA's website, will be a mechanism for that students be able to receive the student CERB. Thank you, Minister. Next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, nous vient de Laura Osman with the Canadian Press. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Good afternoon. This question is for, I think, Minister Hajdu and perhaps Dr. Tam. Some experts have expressed some concerns about the way Canada gathers important health data, particularly related to deaths that could be causing a delay in getting important epidemiological data, like excess deaths, for example. Death certificates are done on paper in some areas. So why is this process so behind in Canada, and is it hindering Canada's ability to gather that important data that other countries seem to have ready access to?
Yes, so we are in the process of looking at that kind of data with Statistics Canada because it's not just about COVID-19 deaths. It's also looking at some of the other impacts. So that is actually something that is taking place. As well, we are in contact with coroners and medical examiners to look at what they can contribute to as well. We started that, building that capacity as part of our ongoing crisis in terms of drug-related poisonings and overdoses. So we are going to try and link with that platform as well. But it's a very important point, and there's a number of pieces of data that we're looking at right now to look at those in parallel or unintended consequences.
Laura, follow-up?
Thank you. Other countries seem to have a more automated process for getting this kind of information. Is Canada's platform sort of behind the times on this?
Well, I think we have highlighted some of the gaps in sort of real-time information on the COVID-19 deaths themselves. So I think we are doing our very best with the provinces to try and see if we can address those gaps. So I think that's clear, particularly in the area of disaggregated analysis that we've already talked about, I think in the last several days. So that is something that we do have to work with. But I think with Statistics Canada, we'll look at some of the other statistical analyses. And, I think it's interesting in that the reporting of deaths is actually not that real time overall when you consider the fact that that's a very specific outcome. But it's something that we're looking at to see if there's different ways in which we can address that. But I think excess mortality is something that we have to look at right now in parallel with the COVID-19 deaths.
Thank you, Dr. Operator. Next question, please.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question, notre prochaine question, is from Alex Bollingal with the Toronto Star. Please go ahead. À vous la parole.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. I think it's for Minister Hajdu. We've seen, based on analysis by some of my colleagues in Toronto, that in Ontario, private or for-profit long-term care homes have had significantly more deaths from COVID-19 than public ones. I'm wondering what you think of that, and if in the reviews of our long-term care system and how we care for vulnerable people in Canada, if looking at changing the way that for-profit care is allowed, whether that would be bringing it into the public system, if that's something that you think should be looked at and done.
Well, thank you very much, Alex. And I think I've been really clear that there is this health crisis has really shone a light on some particular vulnerabilities in long-term care. And obviously, data is starting to emerge about certain characteristics of long-term care that have created even more risk for people that live there. I think our government is very open to reviewing how long-term care is delivered in this country and working with provinces and territories to strengthen quality of life and safety for seniors that live in congregate living settings. And I would say all congregate living settings, although there's a heavy focus on long-term care, there are other groups of individuals that live in congregate settings that also are vulnerable and have, in some cases, substandard care. I'm thinking people with disabilities, for example, or other special needs that may be supported in group settings. But in particular, in terms of long-term care, I don't think there is a minister amongst us that would disagree that we need to do a better job and that the federal government can play some leadership role in this. And we are having those conversations as we speak. How we, not only in terms of how we renew that system in the future, but also how we better support long-term care right now, regardless of how that care is delivered or under what model, to ensure that seniors are safer in their homes.
All right, we're going to pull away from this federal briefing just to wrap up what we have heard over the course of the past couple of hours here with my colleagues, Vashi Kapelas and David Cochrane. Patty Hajdu, the health minister, just mentioning again that this government is very open to reviewing and looking at long-term care in this country. There was a statistic, I think it was on Saturday, I've lost track of days, where Theresa Tam said that though cases in this country long-term care cases in this country account for 20% of all cases, it's now more than 80% of all deaths. So obviously that's going to have to be addressed in a really fundamental way, and the federal government probably will have to pony up a fair amount of cash as some restructuring happens there. Vashi, anything stand out for you there?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, the question from our colleague at the Toronto Star, Tonda, about the border. This is something we saw late in the day Friday. The Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford, come out and say he was adamant, and he conveyed to the Prime Minister alongside, I think he mentioned Premier John Horgan of BC, that they do not want the restrictions on the border between the U.S. and Canada eased anytime soon. And in fact, the amount of screening that is being done at that border should increase. Some interesting questions posed to Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland on that. No specific answer really given there, but I get the impression that there doesn't seem to be any desire on the part of the federal government to ease those restrictions. I've heard Blaine Higgs talk about it. I mean, that seems to be the border of primary concern for premiers, obviously given what's happening with cases in the United States. That's not necessarily a surprise, but that will have sort of long-term implications for the economy as well as the relationship between our two countries. So that's something I think to really watch. And the second jumps off something we've talked about often, and that is the CERB. Obviously, Premier François Legault in Quebec is echoing some of the concerns we've heard from Premier Brian Pallister in Manitoba about what this looks like going forward. I would only note that I spoke to Employment Minister Carla Qualtrough late last week on the heels of those devastating employment numbers. And she said the government's watching to see how much of an uptick there is for the wage subsidy. So how many people end up getting covered by the wage subsidy and then can draw away from the CERB. But if there isn't a massive migration over to that wage subsidy program, they would consider actually extending the CERB. So not getting rid of it, but extending it.
Yeah, and David, again though, that issue around can you get it and not go to work because you don't feel safe, and again, it sounds like something you just have to work out with your employer. So I'm not really sure how that would work either. Still. Yeah, and I no matter how many times Jean-Yves Duclos or the Prime Minister or anyone is asked about this, there is no way a federal Liberal minister in a time of a pandemic is going to sit there and threaten to revoke a subsistence income support program from workers to try to put economic and financial pressure on them to go back to work if they do not feel safe, when there is already a 16-week expiry on the books. And we need to see how this reopening goes. You've seen in some American states where they have done the reopening, business didn't necessarily come back, so there is not the need for the workforce of the pre-pandemic workplace. And you're also seeing in places like Germany and South Korea that have seemed to have been successful. As they started to ease restrictions, cases have started to spike, so they pull back. So all of that needs to be factored into it. And on the Canada-US border, the big thing I think to watch for in that is, to this point, the closures and the extensions have been mutual and done by joint agreement. What happens if it gets to the point, and if Trump is under pressure to start reopening things as he's trying in an election year, and the job market, the economy, and trade is such a big part of what he likes to talk about and campaign about? That is, without question, a situation they're going to have to manage quite delicately going forward. Okay, thanks to both of you for your coverage. You can watch Vashi tonight at 5 Eastern on her show, Power and Politics. And if I read the lineup right, David, you'll be filing for the National, so we'll watch you there too. Thank you both very much. Just a good reminder for all of you who are using that emergency relief benefit. The third period of eligibility does begin today, so you should reapply again today. However, if you think that you might be hired back under the wage subsidy program, probably don't do that, because they will have to come and get that money from you later. Just wanted to remind you of that. I'm Rosemary Barton. This is CBC News Network. Andrew Nichols picks up our coverage after this short break. I'll see you back here tomorrow.